The aftermath of yesterday's violent protests in Charlottesville has eclipsed, at least briefly, the confrontation with North Korea. Joining us now to analyze the coverage, here in L.A., Christina Bellantoni, assistant managing editor for politics of the Los Angeles Times. In Washington, Molly Hemingway, senior editor at The Federalist and a Fox News contributor. And in New York, Jessica Tarloff, senior director at Bustle Trends and also a Fox News contributor. Molly, President Trump drawing just a tsunami of media criticism for denouncing bigotry, denouncing violence on many sides, but not naming the people who carried out these attacks, including the car that rammed into a crowd, driver charged with murder, and that's white nationalists. What's your take?
Well, yeah, the media are very much focusing on this story, this horribly tragic story, which has now led to the death of a woman who was run over by a man driving a car, a man who I think appears to be related to this white nationalist movement. So it's a very significant story. At the same time, you see the media trying to sort of push and hype this story. This was a nationwide rally of white nationalists, and at best they were able to gather just a couple hundred people. So there are two different ways of looking at this. Either you do think you give it wall-to-wall coverage, you very much elevate this tiny marginal group, or other people would say that's exactly what they want. They want that kind of coverage, they want to provoke conflict, they want to provoke quite dramatic interaction, and maybe the media shouldn't be playing into that quite so much.
But Jessica, by making Donald Trump the focus of this protest that turned utterly violent, protest that he had nothing to do with, aren't some critics in the media also being divisive?
Oh, I think the media does play a divisive role in what's going on in today's society, but I do think that this was an incredibly important moment for the President of the United States to step up and to call these domestic terrorists exactly what they are, which are white supremacists and neo-Nazis. He spent years criticizing Barack Obama for not saying radical Islamic terrorism. And we know exactly why Barack Obama refused to do that. He didn't want to alienate the moderate population of Muslims. But there are no moderate neo-Nazis. They do not exist. It is purely an extreme ideology. And so I think the media actually hasn't gone too far. And if our viewers at home, and if you were listening to what Karl Rove said in the past hour with Maria Bartiromo, he said it was disappointing that this was a moment where the president could have gone out there and said the appropriate thing, the moral thing, which is to condemn this group by their name, just as his daughter did this morning on Twitter.
Right, I was going to mention that. Christina Bellantoni, it's been just 24 hours since this awful violence. The death toll is now 3 dozen people injured. And the whole story has turned into Trump's response. The lead story in Politico this morning, Trump fails to condemn white supremacists in statement on Charlottesville violence.
That's the lead story in Politico, which is a political outlet, right?
I've seen a lot of similar headlines, including one in the New York Times.
It's the President of the United States, and so his words do matter. His words will get the focus. You know, we're going to talk about that with North Korea. What's important here is condemning violence no matter who is perpetrating it, and the president should have called them out by name, and his Republican colleagues and Democrats across the aisle all said you should have named this organization, you should have strongly condemned this. But the idea that anybody would endorse any kind of violence is wrong at any levels of government. And this is a moment, this is like a tinderbox, right? We've seen this across the country, violence. Now it's getting even more severe with people dead. People need to condemn violence no matter where it's happening, whether it's at rallies or with Democrats or Republicans or white nationalists, and the president leads by example.
You know, well, the president did do that, Molly. Let me just jump in, and sorry to cut you off. I personally think it would have been better if he had mentioned white nationalists, as his daughter Ivanka did. But we did go through this, as Jessica points out, with Barack Obama, who also got criticized heavily for refusing to call out radical Islamic terrorists, and I think he should have done that. What explains this extraordinary level of media coverage on presidential language?
Well, first off, I feel like people are responding to something they believe Donald Trump did or didn't say, as opposed to what he actually said. They take this first line of lengthy statements he gave on the violence, and they just take that one statement where he says there's violence on both sides or something to that effect. He also explicitly condemns racism. He explicitly talks about the need for people to love one another. I don't think that the full statement is being included here, and I think that the media have kind of whipped themselves into a frenzy in a way that doesn't match with the rest of the country. I'm glad we just heard reference to other violent rallies, and the country has experienced in recent years a lot of violent rallies, and they are on different fringe sides. They're not fringe, just fringe right. There's also fringe left, and we've seen violent rallies in Ferguson and Charlotte and Baltimore and Portland and Oakland and Milwaukee and Minneapolis and New York and many other places. And people, I think, understand that there are these fringe elements that are convincing themselves about being violent toward their fellow American, and that's not something that is just in one political enclave. It's actually a problem we have across the spectrum, and it's actually a good idea then for a president to speak to all of those things.
And Molly, I take your point absolutely, and I realize that this is fringe. Obviously, the vast majority of white people in this country are not white supremacists or neo-Nazis. But don't you agree that this was a great opportunity for the president to make his views clear on this specific group when every other Republican was doing it as well? This isn't a bipartisan issue.
Jessica, hold on. Let me turn this back to the press. It seems like to the extent that the president did repeatedly and forcefully condemn bigotry and violence, maybe but not with the specific language that you or others may have preferred, that the press doesn't have much interest in that. It only wants to make what he didn't say the story.
Yeah, no, I understand that, and as I led in my initial statement, I do think that the media plays a divisive role here. I just happen to think that they haven't gone too far in asking questions about why the President of the United States chose not to use that language today. I agree, there are fringe groups of all types across the country who rally and who get violent, and it should all be condemned. But at this moment, I don't know why the press is wrong to be asking a president who was a leader in the birther movement, for instance, why he isn't using the explicit language when his own daughter is, and when his wife had to be the first person from 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue to come out and condemn it with her tweet yesterday.
All right. The White House says that the president was referring to the fact that there was violence between protesters and counter-protesters. Let's pull back the camera a little bit, Christina. Obviously, if there's violence at a protest, we have to cover it. But there were already lots of TV cameras there in Charlottesville, Virginia, for the possibility that something might go wrong. Do the media pay too much attention in general to these fringe groups?
It's a really important question newsrooms have. During the Republican National Convention, there were some white nationalists there, and the LA Times spent some time talking to them, asking them their motivations, and we got a lot of criticism. Why would you give any headlines to this movement? But part of it is understanding this is an element of society. It doesn't matter what the percentage is. This is out there, and so trying to understand motivations, get them to be able to say, like, this is what it's about. It's a very delicate situation, but it is important to listen and try to, maybe that can solve some problems if you get some information out there.